It was November 9th, 1989, just another cold autumn evening in Berlin, or so it seemed at first. But by the time the sun rose the next morning, the air was electric with change. A moment etched into history had unfolded. After nearly 3 decades of division, the Berlin Wall had fallen. To understand the significance of this event, we need to rewind to the end of World War II. Germany, once the epicenter of global conflict, was divided into zones controlled by the Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Berlin, the capital, lay deep within the Soviet zone and was also split into 4 sectors. Two conflicting ideologies, capitalism and communism, were now awkward roommates within a shattered country. This tense coexistence couldn't last. By 1949, East Germany, officially known as the German Democratic Republic, emerged under Soviet influence, while West Germany aligned itself with democratic Western powers. Berlin became a fault line in the Cold War, and its division was symbolic of the growing rift between Eastern and Western blocs. Over the following years, the contest for supremacy between these ideologies intensified. Policies hardened, borders tightened, and East German citizens desperate for freedom began escaping to the West in droves. By 1961, nearly 3 million people had fled East Germany, a brain drain the communist government could no longer tolerate. The solution? A wall, not just a physical barricade, but one built out of fear, control, and suppression. In the early hours of August 13, 1961, construction began. Families were suddenly separated, lives uprooted, and the city of Berlin split in two. At first, it was just barbed wire, hastily thrown up overnight. But soon, it evolved into an imposing concrete barrier, fortified with guard towers, floodlights, and a notorious death strip, where any attempt to breach the perimeter often ended in tragedy. For nearly 28 years, the Berlin Wall stood as the Cold War's most potent symbol, a stark reminder of a divided world. But then, the world began to shift. In the 1980s, cracks started forming in the Soviet Union's grasp over its satellite states. Economies were faltering, dissent was growing louder, and new leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev were rethinking hardline policies. Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika and glasnost, introduced elements of economic restructuring and political openness in the Soviet Union. Although these reforms were meant to strengthen socialism, they inadvertently emboldened resistance movements across Eastern Europe. By 1989, the winds of change were sweeping through the Eastern Bloc. Protests erupted in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, calling for greater freedoms and democracy. East Germany was no exception. Throughout the late summer and autumn of 1989, demonstrations swelled in cities like Leipzig and Dresden. Tens of thousands took to the streets demanding reform, chanting slogans like, "Wir sind das Volk," "We are the people." The East German government was on shaky ground, but no one could have predicted how quickly things would unravel. Then came that fateful night. It all started with a press conference earlier in the day. Günter Schabowski, a senior East German official, stood before reporters, fumbling through a stack of papers. He announced new travel regulations, which would allow East Germans to cross the border into the West. But there was confusion. When asked when this would take effect, Schabowski hesitated, then muttered the words, "As far as I know, immediately." That simple, off-the-cuff remark spread like wildfire. Within hours, East Berliners began gathering at the wall's checkpoints, cautiously testing the waters. The border guards were ill-prepared. They hadn't received clear instructions and were overwhelmed by the growing crowds. By evening, the pressure had mounted to the point of no return. At 11:30 p.m., one guard made a fateful decision. He opened the gates. The response was euphoric. Tens of thousands flooded through the checkpoints, greeted by cheers and champagne from their counterparts in the West. Strangers hugged, kissed, danced, and cried in the streets. Families long separated were reunited in moments of overwhelming emotion. By midnight, Berlin's most infamous symbol of division had become the world's greatest impromptu party. Images of people climbing the wall, hammering away at its surface, and celebrating on both sides quickly spread across the globe. These scenes were a stunning visual testament to the power of unity, the shared human yearning for freedom. But the moment was about more than just Berlin. The fall of the wall signaled the unraveling of the Iron Curtain that had divided Europe since the end of World War II. Within months, communist regimes across Eastern Europe crumbled one by one. By October 1990, Germany was reunified, and by 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. And yet, the story of November 9th, 1989, is not just about geopolitics. It's about people. It's about ordinary men and women who dared to dream of a better future, who resisted oppression with the tools they had, their voices, their hope, and their unity. Today, fragments of the Berlin Wall still stand, a reminder of the price that was paid for freedom and the walls, both physical and ideological, that still remain in our world. The fall of the wall wasn't just the closing of a chapter, it was the opening of a new one that redefined an entire generation and inspired the belief that no barrier, no matter how high or thick, is truly invincible. On that cold November night, history didn't just happen, it was made, and it demonstrated the undeniable truth that even in the darkest of times, walls are no match for the will of the people.